Picture this: a cold morning in 1612, in the shadow of Pendle Hill, England. A young girl points a trembling finger at her neighbor, whispering of clay poppets and a demonic cat named Tibbs. Within months, 10 people swing from the gallows, their only crime being whispered rumors and the fear of a town convinced the devil walked among them. This was no isolated horror. For centuries, from the forests of Germany to the colonies of America, thousands met gruesome fates accused of witchcraft, burned, drowned, or hanged on evidence as flimsy as a neighbor's dream or a child's fevered tale. Today, we descend into the darkness to uncover 20 of history's most infamous witch trials, where superstition bled into law and the supernatural was treated as fact. You'll hear of kings haunted by storms they blamed on witches, villages wiped out by paranoia, and confessions torn from scream stories where the line between zealotry and madness vanished like smoke from the pyre. These weren't just trials, they were windows into a world where every misfortune, from spoiled crops to a stillborn child, could ignite a hunt for someone to blame. So light a candle and steel your nerves. By the end, you'll question how easily fear can twist truth, and whether the echoes of these hunts still whisper in our own time. The gallows await. Let's begin. Now we turn to the first of these chilling trials, the case of the Pendle Witches. In 1612, Lancashire became the stage for one of England's most notorious witch hunts, fueled by rumors of dark magic and spectral horrors. The accusations centered on two rival families, the Devices and the Chattoxes, who were said to practice maleficium, harmful witchcraft. Witnesses claimed the women crafted clay poppets to curse their enemies, sticking pins into the tiny figures to inflict pain or death from afar. But the most damning evidence came from 9-year-old Janet Device, who testified against her own family, describing a demonic familiar in the form of a black cat named Tibbs. This spectral creature, she claimed, whispered evil commands to the accused. Under the weight of such fantastical claims, and with no real proof beyond frightened whispers, 10 people were hanged at Lancaster Castle. What makes the Pendle trials especially haunting is how ordinary grudges spiraled into lethal hysteria, proving how easily fear could turn neighbor against neighbor in the name of rooting out evil. Now we journey north to Scotland, where the waves of fear crested in a storm of accusations. The North Berwick Witch Trials of 1590–92 were no ordinary hunt, they were personal. King James VI, later James I of England, became obsessed with witchcraft after violent storms nearly sank the ship carrying his bride, Anne of Denmark. Convinced dark forces were at work, he ordered a brutal investigation. Under torture, dozens confessed to unthinkable crimes, gathering at midnight on North Berwick's windswept shores, raising tempests by tossing cats into the sea, and conspiring with the devil himself to drown the king. One accused witch, Agnes Sampson, described a chilling ritual where witches sailed in sieves to summon the storms that threatened Anne's voyage. These forced confessions, extracted through sleeplessness and agony, fed James's paranoia. He even penned a book, Demonology, defending witch hunts as holy duty. What began as a royal vendetta against the weather spiraled into a national terror, proving how easily power could weaponize superstition, turning the sea's fury into proof of Satan's hand. But the terror did not stop at Scotland's shores. As we cross into Germany, a darker chapter unfolds, one where fear became an epidemic. The Bamberg Witch Trials between 1626 and 31 stand as one of history's most horrifying waves of persecution. In this small Catholic prince-bishopric, over 1,000 people, men, women, even children, were burned at the stake after being accused of witchcraft. No one was safe, not even the town's own mayor, Johannes Junius. His case chills the blood to this day. Arrested in 1628, Junius endured brutal torture until he confessed to attending satanic gatherings and renouncing God. But what makes his story unforgettable is the secret letter he scribbled in prison, smuggled out by a sympathetic guard. In it, he described how his limbs were crushed in thumbscrews, how needles were driven under his nails, and how, after days of agony, he finally lied, admitting to crimes he never committed just to end the pain. His words survive as raw testimony to the horrors inflicted in the name of rooting out evil. The trials spiraled so out of control that entire families vanished, their properties seized by the church. Bamberg became a cautionary tale of how power, paranoia, and blind faith could turn neighbor against neighbor, until the very streets ran thick with smoke and screams. Yet the flames of persecution spread even further, igniting another German city in a frenzy of fear. The Trier Witch Trials, unfolding between 1581 and 93, became one of the most devastating witch hunts in history, a wildfire of paranoia that consumed entire communities. At the heart of this horror stood Archbishop Johann von Schönenberg, a man convinced that Satan's influence had poisoned his diocese. When crop failures and disease struck the region, he saw not misfortune but witchcraft. Under his ruthless direction, accusations spiraled into a bloodbath. Villages were left nearly empty as neighbors turned on one another, desperate to escape suspicion. The trials followed a grimly familiar script: torture-forced confessions of midnight pacts with the devil, orgies on the Brocken Mountain, and spells cast to blight harvests. But what set Trier apart was its sheer scale. By the end, over 360 people, from wealthy landowners to beggars, had been burned or hanged. Among the victims were children as young as 7, accused of attending Sabbats after being coerced into testifying against their own families. The archbishop's zeal even targeted fellow clergy, with priests and monks executed for allegedly leading congregations into heresy. Trier's tragedy reveals how easily hunger and hardship could be twisted into proof of the supernatural, and how those in power weaponized superstition to erase dissent, seize property, and tighten their grip on a terrified populace. The echoes of their suffering linger in the silent fields where whole generations vanished, leaving behind only ash and unanswered questions. But the terror did not end in Trier. Just a few years later, another German city would descend into an even darker chapter of witch hunting madness. The Würzburg Witch Trials between 1626 and 31 stand out for their sheer brutality, especially the executions of innocent children and respected clergy. Here, the accusations took on a grotesque theatricality, with stories of witches flying through the night to attend demonic gatherings on Blocksberg Mountain. Witnesses described unholy orgies, pacts signed in blood, and even claims that witches could shapeshift into animals. The hysteria reached such heights that no one was safe. Over 300 people were burned, including boys as young as 9 and girls barely into their teens. Among the victims were 19 priests, a choir boy, and the city's own vice-chancellor, proof that even high status couldn't shield you from suspicion. Torture extracted wild confessions, like one woman who claimed she'd been carried to the mountain by a demonic goat. But perhaps most chilling was how ordinary these victims were. Court records list beggars, students, even a blind girl, all condemned for impossible crimes. The trials only stopped when the city ran out of executioners, not because the madness faded. Würzburg's tragedy shows how easily fear could erase reason, turning neighbors into executioners and children into targets. It's a stark reminder that when superstition holds the whip, no one escapes its lash. Now let's journey southwest to the Basque Country, where Spain's largest and most horrifying witch hunt unfolded between 1609 and 14. The Basque Witch Trials, centered in Logroño, became a spectacle of terror under the Spanish Inquisition. Here, the accusations took a bizarre turn. Villagers confessed under torture to impossible crimes, like shape-shifting into animals and poisoning livestock with cursed potions. The trials reached their climax in a massive auto-da-fe, a public execution meant to cleanse the land of supposed evil. over 30 people were burned at the stake, their confessions extracted through brutal methods like the strappado, where victims were suspended by their wrists until their shoulders dislocated. What makes these trials especially chilling is how deeply superstition had infected even the most ordinary lives. One woman, Maria de Zimmeldegui, claimed she flew to demonic gatherings on a broomstick made of human bones. Others described midnight pacts with the devil where they pledged their souls in exchange for dark powers. But perhaps the most tragic detail, many of the accused were healers and midwives, their knowledge of herbs twisted into evidence of witchcraft. The trials only ended when the Inquisition itself grew skeptical, realizing the confessions were coerced fantasies. Yet the damage was done, families were shattered, and fear lingered for generations. The Basque Witch Trials remind us how easily fear can warp reality, turning folk remedies into signs of Satan and neighbors into monsters. As the flames of Logroño faded, another wave of hysteria was already brewing across the Atlantic, one that would forever stain colonial history. But that's a story for another trial. Crossing the Atlantic, we arrive in the small Puritan village of Salem, Massachusetts, where fear took root in a way that would echo through history. The Salem Witch Trials of 1692 to 93 began with something seemingly harmless: the strange fits of two young girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. But what started as unexplained convulsions soon spiraled into a full-blown witch hunt, fueled by the terrifying idea of spectral torment. The afflicted girls claimed invisible witches were attacking them, pinching and biting them with ghostly hands. In a community already steeped in religious fervor, these accusations were taken as undeniable proof of the devil's work. The trials took a dark turn with the introduction of spectral evidence, testimony that an accused witch's spirit had tormented the victim, even if the accused was physically elsewhere. This allowed mere accusations to become death sentences. Among the most heartbreaking cases was Giles Corey, an elderly farmer who refused to enter a plea. In a brutal attempt to force a confession, authorities piled heavy stones on his chest in a practice called peine forte et dure. His final words, "more weight," became a grim defiance of the hysteria. But what really caused the girls' fits? Modern theories point to ergot poisoning, a fungal infection in rye bread that can cause hallucinations and muscle spasms. Yet in Salem, the explanation was far more sinister: witchcraft. By the time the trials ended, 19 innocent people had been hanged and one man crushed to death. The panic only subsided when respected figures began questioning the validity of spectral evidence, and the governor finally disbanded the court. The Salem Witch Trials stand as a stark reminder of how fear can distort justice, turning whispers into verdicts and neighbors into enemies. And as the gallows fell silent in Massachusetts, another wave of terror was rising in Europe, this time in the shadow of a nobleman's estate. But that's a story for our next trial. Now let's journey back even further in time to the Alpine valleys of Switzerland, where one of the earliest and most brutal witch hunts in Europe unfolded. The Valais Witch Trials, spanning from 1428 to 47, were a chilling precursor to the waves of persecution that would sweep across the continent. Here, the terror wasn't just about curses or spectral evidence, it was tied to something far more visceral: the Black Death. As plague ravaged communities, desperate villagers searched for someone to blame. Their target, witches accused of concocting deadly ointments from the fat of unbaptized babies, a substance believed to spread disease with a single touch. These accusations weren't just superstition, they were a lethal cocktail of fear and religious extremism. The trials became a frenzy, with entire villages turning on one another. Hundreds, possibly thousands, were burned or hanged, their deaths justified as a purge of evil in a world teetering on the edge of apocalypse. What makes Valais particularly haunting is how it set the template for later witch hunts. Torture extracted confessions of grotesque rituals, like smearing plague-tainted ointments on door handles or dancing with the devil under a blood-red moon. The accused, often poor women or outsiders, had no defense against such fantastical claims. By the time the trials ended, Valais was a graveyard of shattered lives, a grim warning of how easily panic can become genocide. Yet, even as the flames died down in Switzerland, another horror was brewing, this time in the heart of Germany, where a prince abbot would turn his domain into a slaughterhouse. But that's a darkness we'll face next. As the shadow of witch hunts crept deeper into Germany, another chapter of terror unfolded under the rule of a man who wielded both sacred and sinister power. Prince Abbot Balthasar von Dernbach of Fulda didn't just fear witchcraft, he declared war on it. From 1603 to 1606, his small principality became a slaughterhouse with over 250 people, mostly women, dragged to the stake. But what set Fulda apart was its sinister focus: midwives and healers accused of wielding the evil eye to cause stillbirths and infant deaths. In a time when childbirth was perilous and infant mortality high, von Dernbach twisted grief into guilt. He claimed these women had made pacts with the devil, using their knowledge of herbs and anatomy not to heal but to kill. Under torture, confessions spilled forth tales of cursed amulets, midnight rituals, and hexes whispered over cradles. The Prince Abbot's courts accepted these grotesque stories without question, fueled by his fanatical belief that purging witches would restore God's favor. Yet the Fulda trials reveal a darker truth. This wasn't just superstition. It was a calculated purge of women who held power, the kind that threatened male authority. Midwives, often the only healthcare providers in villages, were accused precisely because they understood life's fragile beginnings. By destroying them, von Dernbach didn't just erase individuals. He severed a lifeline of female knowledge passed down for generations. By the time his reign of terror ended, Fulda's pyres had cooled, but the scars lingered. And as the echoes of screams faded, another horror was already taking shape. This time in France, where whispers of demonic possession would ignite one of history's most salacious witch trials. But that's a story for another moment. Now, let's cross the border into France, where the line between divine ecstasy and demonic possession blurred in one of history's most scandalous witch trials. In 1611, the quiet convent of Ursuline nuns in Aix-en-Provence became the stage for a spectacle that would shock Europe. At the center of it all was Louis Goffridi, a charismatic priest accused of something unthinkable, using witchcraft to plunge these devout women into erotic frenzies. The hysteria began when a young nun named Madeleine de Demandaux fell into violent fits, writhing and screaming about Goffridi's demonic influence. Under pressure, she claimed the priest had seduced her with a satanic pact, marking her body with invisible witches' marks and forcing her into unholy rituals. Soon, other nuns joined in, their collective hysteria painting lurid tales of midnight orgies, flying to Sabbats, and even being married to demons. What made the Aix-en-Provence case so explosive wasn't just the accusations. It was the sheer theatricality of it all. Exorcists staged public spectacles where nuns contorted their bodies, spoke in guttural voices, and even levitated, all while naming Goffridi as their tormentor. The priest's trial became a frenzy of sensational confessions, extracted under torture, detailing everything from cursed communion wafers to demonic shapeshifting. But beneath the salacious details lay a darker truth. Goffridi's real crime may have been his popularity. As a traveling preacher, he'd amassed a devoted following, and his unorthodox methods threatened the church's authority. By branding him a witch, officials didn't just silence a man. They sent a chilling message about who controlled spiritual power. When the flames consumed Goffridi in 1611, the nuns' possessions mysteriously ceased. Yet the trial's legacy endured, a stark reminder of how easily desire, faith, and fear could be twisted into a weapon. And as the smoke cleared over Provence, another kind of witchcraft panic was brewing, one that would pit neighbor against neighbor in a quiet English village. But that's a tale for next time. Leaving behind the scandal of Aix-en-Provence, we journey to the rolling hills of England, where a noble family's tragedy would ignite one of the most heartbreaking witch trials of the era. In 1618, the Earl of Rutland's household was struck by an unthinkable calamity. His two young sons fell violently ill and died within months of each other. Desperate for answers, the grieving Earl turned his suspicion toward three women from the village of Belvoir, Joan Flower and her daughters Margaret and Philippa. The Flowers family had once worked as servants in the Earl's castle, but after being dismissed, rumors began to swirl. Joan, a sharp-tongued woman with a knowledge of herbs, was accused of muttering curses as she left. When the boys succumbed to their mysterious illnesses, the family's grief twisted into vengeance. Under interrogation, the Flowers women were accused of crafting grotesque poppets, cloth dolls representing the Earl's sons, and piercing them with pins. Even more chilling, witnesses claimed Joan had cursed a pair of gloves given to one of the boys, embedding them with dark magic. But the trial's most shocking moment came when Joan Flower, defiant to the end, demanded a bizarre test of innocence. She swore she would choke if she couldn't swallow bread blessed by a priest. When the morsel lodged in her throat, killing her before she could stand trial, the crowd saw it as divine proof of guilt. Her daughters, left to face judgment alone, confessed under torture and were hanged in 1619. What makes the Belvoir case so haunting isn't just the accusations, it's the raw human tragedy beneath them. The Flowers women, likely poor and marginalized, became scapegoats for a family's unbearable grief. And while the Earl sought answers in witchcraft, modern historians suspect the boys may have died from something far more mundane, perhaps illness or poisoning. But in an age of superstition, there was no room for doubt. As the gallows claimed Margaret and Philippa, another witch hunt was already stirring, this time in the misty lowlands of Scotland, where a child's terrifying visions would spark a final, bloody reckoning. But that's a story for another moment. Now, as the echoes of Belvoir's tragedy fade, we cross into Scotland, where a child's nightmare would ignite the flames of one final, brutal witch hunt. In 1697, the quiet town of Paisley became the stage for Scotland's last mass execution of so-called witches, all because of an 11-year-old girl named Christian Shaw. Christian, the daughter of a wealthy landowner, began suffering violent fits, screaming that she was tormented by invisible forces. She claimed 7 local women, including a servant named Catherine Campbell, had cursed her after a dispute in a tavern. But the accusations grew even darker. Christian described visions of the women summoning Satan himself, dancing with the devil in the shadows of Paisley's streets. The town erupted in panic. The accused were dragged to trial, where Christian's testimony was taken as gospel. No physical evidence tied the women to witchcraft, but in an era where a child's ravings could seal a fate, logic held no power. Under torture, one of the accused, Margaret Lang, confessed to signing a pact with the devil, a confession she later retracted, but it was too late. On a grim day in 1697, 7 women were hanged and their bodies burned, a spectacle meant to purge Paisley of evil. Yet what's most chilling isn't the supernatural claims, it's the aftermath. Christian Shaw, the accuser, grew up to become a wealthy businesswoman, her childhood possession never questioned. Modern scholars suggest her fits may have been a case of conversion disorder, a psychological response to trauma, or even a calculated act of revenge. But in 17th century Scotland, there was no room for such explanations. The Paisley trials marked the end of an era, a final gasp of witch hunting hysteria before the Enlightenment dawned. And as the smoke cleared over Gallow Green, another story was already unfolding, this time in a Polish village, where fear would twist into violence once more. But that we'll save for next. Yet even as the Enlightenment began to cast doubt on superstition, fear still held sway in the most unexpected places. Our next chapter takes us to the quiet village of Dorchało in Poland, where in 1783, a time when Europe was supposedly embracing reason, 14 women met a horrifying fate over accusations as old as the hills. The spark came when a local nobleman's livestock began dying mysteriously and his crops withered overnight. In an age where science was advancing, the villagers of Dorochawa reached for an ancient explanation: witchcraft. Suspicion fell on the women of the town, particularly those who lived on the margins: midwives, herbalists, the poor. Under torture, they confessed to cursing the nobleman's land, their screams echoing in a trial that defied the era's growing skepticism. What makes Dorochawa chilling isn't just the brutality, but the timing. By the late 18th century, many European courts had abandoned witch trials, dismissing them as relics of a darker past. Yet here, in a remote Polish village, old fears flared anew. The 14 accused were tied to stakes and burned, their deaths a grim reminder that progress doesn't always reach everywhere at once. Historians now believe the nobleman's losses were likely due to disease or blight, natural disasters twisted into something supernatural by panic. But in Dorochawa, reason arrived too late. As the ashes settled, the village became a cautionary tale of how easily enlightenment can be overshadowed by the darkness of collective fear. And while Poland's witch hunts ended here, the echoes of such hysteria would soon resurface, this time on the misty shores of Ireland. Yet even as the flames of Dorochawa faded, the shadow of witchcraft stretched across Europe to a place where such trials were unheard of: Ireland. Here, in the quiet coastal village of Eilandmagi, a bizarre case unfolded in 1711 that would become the island's sole recorded witch trial. The chaos began when 18-year-old Mary Dunbar, a servant in the household of a local magistrate, began suffering violent fits. Witnesses claimed she levitated, spoke in tongues, and accused 8 women from the village of tormenting her with supernatural powers. The accused, mostly poor, elderly, or outsiders, were swiftly arrested. What followed was a trial steeped in spectacle, with Mary's dramatic performances in court convincing authorities of demonic involvement. What sets Eilandmagi apart is its isolation from Europe's witch-hunting frenzy. Ireland had no tradition of mass witch trials, making this an outlier fueled by imported fears. The 8 women were convicted not of witchcraft but of malicious sorcery, a legal loophole that allowed their imprisonment rather than execution. They endured a year in Carrickfergus jail, their fate a strange blend of mercy and hysteria. Modern scholars suggest Mary's possession may have been epilepsy, psychological distress, or even performance, a desperate bid for attention in a rigid society. But in 1711, her accusations exposed how easily fear could cross borders, turning neighbor against neighbor. As we'll see next, this theme of contagious panic would reach its peak in a Scottish tavern, where accusations of satanic pact sealed 7 fates. Now, let's journey from Ireland's isolated hysteria to a case that gripped England: the infamous witches of Warboys. In 1589, the Throckmorton household became the center of a nightmare when 5 daughters began suffering violent, unexplainable fits. Their limbs twisted, their voices turned unnatural, and they accused an elderly neighbor, Alice Samuel, of cursing them with a bewitched handkerchief. The Throckmorton girls' afflictions were eerily similar to other cases of supposed demonic possession: convulsions, speaking in tongues, even predicting future events. But what made Warboys unique was the sheer persistence of the accusations. For years, the family insisted Alice was to blame, even after she was examined by local clergy and magistrates. Under pressure, Alice eventually confessed, likely after enduring psychological torment, admitting she'd given the girls a cursed token. The trial itself was a spectacle. Witnesses claimed Alice's mere glance could send the girls into fits, and her spectral form was said to haunt their bedroom. In 1593, Alice, along with her daughter and husband, was hanged. But the tragedy didn't end there. Decades later, one of the Throckmorton sisters admitted the fits had been exaggerated, a chilling glimpse into how fear could warp truth. This case reveals a darker truth. Accusations often targeted the vulnerable. Alice was an elderly woman with no power, while the Throckmortons were a wealthy, influential family. Their word carried weight, sealing her fate, and as we'll see next, this pattern of panic would spiral even further in Sweden, where children's tales of satanic abductions ignited one of history's most brutal witch hunts. Now, let's turn our attention to Sweden, where whispers of the supernatural took a horrifying turn in 1617. The Finspång witch trials began with a chilling rumor. Children claimed they'd been whisked away to Blackkulla Meadow, a mythical gathering place where witches allegedly feasted and danced with the devil. These stories, spread by terrified youngsters, spiraled into mass hysteria, accusing dozens of women of kidnapping children for Satan's dark rituals. What followed was a merciless ordeal. Suspected witches were subjected to the brutal water test, thrown into a lake with their hands and feet bound. If they floated, it was proof of guilt as the water rejected their evil. If they sank, they were innocent, though many drowned before they could be pulled out. 70 women met this gruesome fate, their deaths justified by the twisted logic of the time. But the real horror lies in the accusers themselves. Many of the children later admitted their tales were fabrications, spurred by fear or coercion. Yet the damage was done. The Finspång trials reveal how easily superstition could be weaponized, turning innocent lives into casualties of collective panic. And as we'll see next, this wave of terror didn't stop at Sweden's borders. It echoed across Europe, leaving even more devastation in its wake. Now, the shadow of witch hunts stretches deeper into Bavaria, where the Eichstätt trials unfolded over nearly 5 decades of terror. Here, the accusations took a bizarre and sinister turn. Women like Barbara Riffin were branded as witch brides, said to have pledged themselves to the devil in grotesque mockeries of marriage. Witnesses claimed these ceremonies involved shape-shifting, where the accused transformed into animals or even inanimate objects to evade detection. The trials were fueled by a perfect storm of religious fervor and local superstition. Authorities, convinced the devil was recruiting brides to corrupt the faithful, extracted confessions through relentless torture. Barbara Riffin's case was particularly chilling. She admitted under duress to attending midnight Sabbats, where she danced with demons and sealed her pact with a kiss to Satan's clawed hand. Her execution, like hundreds of others, was meant to purify the community, but it only spread paranoia. What makes Eichstätt haunting is how ordinary lives were twisted into nightmares. Neighbors turned on one another, accusing women of cursing livestock or brewing storms, all proof of their unholy unions. By the time the hunts ended in 1637, the region was scarred by a legacy of fear. And as we'll soon see, this same dread would seep into the Rhine Valley, where wine barrels and weather became weapons in the eyes of a panicked populace. But the terror didn't stop at Bavaria. Along the misty banks of the Rhine, another wave of panic was brewing, this time in Cologne, where wine and weather became the stuff of nightmares. Between 1627 and 1630, the city became a stage for some of the most bizarre accusations in witch trial history. Imagine a world where a spoiled cask of wine or an unexpected storm wasn't just bad luck, it was proof of witchcraft. The trials here followed a grimly familiar script. Under torture, accused women confessed to impossible crimes like summoning hailstorms to ruin crops or cursing wine barrels to turn the drink sour. One particularly chilling account claimed a witch had hexed an entire vineyard, causing the grapes to rot overnight. Of course, these confessions were extracted through brutal methods, but to the terrified people of Cologne, they were undeniable evidence of Satan's influence. What made these trials especially sinister was how deeply they intertwined with daily life. Wine wasn't just a drink, it was livelihood, trade, and even faith in a region famed for its vineyards. When barrels spoiled or storms struck, fear spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered, pointing fingers at outcasts, midwives, or even elderly women who lived alone. By the time the hunt subsided, Cologne's streets were haunted by more than just ghosts. They were scarred by the memory of innocent lives lost to superstition. And as we'll see next, this same hysteria would cross borders, reaching Sweden, where children's tales of satanic abductions would ignite one of history's most infamous witch panics. Now let's journey north to Sweden, where whispers of the supernatural took a horrifying turn in the small village of Mora. Here, in 1669, the panic didn't start with angry mobs or suspicious neighbors, it began with children. The chaos erupted when a group of young girls claimed they'd been abducted by witches and taken to a place called Blackula, a meadow said to be Satan's own gathering ground. Under pressure, the children spun vivid tales of dark rituals, feasts with the devil, and even being forced to sign his book in blood. These stories spread like wildfire, and soon entire families were dragged into the hysteria. What made the Mora trials especially tragic was how easily the accusations snowballed. Once one child pointed a finger, others followed, fearing they'd be next if they stayed silent. Authorities, eager to root out evil, accepted these fantastical claims as truth. By the time the trials ended, 85 people, mostly women, had been executed, their lives cut short by the imaginations of terrified children. And here's a chilling footnote: centuries later, these very accounts of nocturnal abductions and eerie gatherings in the woods would inspire modern horror, including the cult classic The Blair Witch Project. It's a stark reminder that the fears of the past still haunt our stories today. But the terror didn't end in Sweden. Our final stop takes us to England, where 3 women would become the last to hang for witchcraft in a case as bizarre as it was heartbreaking. Now we arrive at the final chapter of this dark saga, the haunting case of the Bideford Witches. In 1682, England witnessed its last official witch hangings, a grim milestone that unfolded in the small coastal town of Bideford. 3 women, Temperance Lloyd, Mary Trembles, and Susanna Edwards, found themselves at the center of a storm of superstition and fear. The accusations against them were as bizarre as they were cruel. Townsfolk claimed the women had cursed ships, causing them to sink or vanish at sea. Even stranger were the tales of their so-called familiars, imps with peculiar names like Puaket, who allegedly did their bidding. These stories, fueled by gossip and paranoia, painted the women as agents of chaos, blamed for everything from failed crops to unexplained illnesses. What makes this trial especially chilling is how flimsy the evidence was. Confessions were extracted under duress, with the elderly Temperance Lloyd likely confused and terrified, admitting to fantastical crimes she couldn't possibly have committed. The court, eager to purge the town of evil, ignored glaring inconsistencies and sentenced all 3 to the gallows. Their deaths marked the end of an era, as England gradually turned away from witch hunts, though far too late for these innocent victims. And so, with the Bideford Witches, we close this grim catalogue of fear and injustice. But their stories, like so many others, force us to ask, how easily could any of us become the next target when hysteria takes hold? It's a question that lingers long after the final page of history is turned. As we step back from these 20 harrowing tales of witch trials, a chilling pattern emerges, one woven from fear, ignorance, and the darkest corners of human nature. Time and again, we've seen how easily communities turn to scapegoating, blaming the marginalized for misfortunes they couldn't explain. Whether it was the Pendle Witches accused of summoning demonic cats or the Bideford women condemned for imaginary imps, the accusations often masked deeper anxieties: crop failures, disease, or political unrest. But perhaps the most horrifying thread is the role of torture. From the Bamberg trials to Salem, coerced confessions turned fantasy into so-called evidence. Victims like Johannes Junius writing his heartbreaking letter from prison, or Giles Corey crushed under stones for refusing to plead, revealed the brutal machinery of these hunts. And let's not forget the mass hysteria, the way rumors spread like wildfire, as in Mora, where children's stories led to 85 executions. Yet here's the unsettling truth: these forces aren't locked in the past. Modern witch hunts still erupt, whether in viral conspiracy theories, online mobs, or the persecution of outsiders. The same fears that fueled medieval pyres now take digital form. So as we close this chapter, ask yourself, how do we recognize the warning signs today? How do we stop history's echoes from becoming tomorrow's tragedies? If this journey through the shadows has gripped you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more deep dives into history's untold stories. Your support helps us keep uncovering the past so we can better understand the present. Until next time, stay curious and stay vigilant. The witches of history may be gone, but the lessons they left behind are more vital than ever.